Welcome to Real Herbalism Radio, show 285, recorded at Big Doc Studios in Eugene, Oregon. Today's show is made possible by therealherbmarket.com. Wouldn't it be nice if there was an online store that sold herbals from verified herbalists making crafted herbal products? Now there is, therealherbmarket.com. Now here are your hosts.
I'm Candace Hunter.
I'm Patrick Hunter. And welcome to Real Herbalism Radio. Eastern European herbalism. What a niche. It was really interesting to talk with them about, cultures that, were just, that whole idea just being eliminated. And it just brought back all of those, this horror story, this historical things through all the different times.
Yeah, for me, it really touched an area that has been aching for me or aching in me for a long time. And that's, I'm an American, which means what exactly? America doesn't have an herbal culture or herbal tradition. Parts of America do, like the Native Americans have that. And,
there's some...
people that are of different descents, people from India that are American now, are American, fully American, but they have a cultural history that brought Ayurveda here. But I'm a white girl. Ayurveda isn't technically my own cultural history, nor is it that of America, because America is such a melting pot.
Well, that's fair, but I would also say that there are some areas. Phyllis Delight was somebody that kind of illustrated the fact that there was in their areas, and it seemed to me like whether it was her or other people, it has to do with a lot of poverty. To be in an area where you don't have access to all this, but grandma knows, and she passes it down, and everybody knows because whatever. Or there's a healer, if you will, in the town that everybody knows, right? Because they can't afford the doctor.
Up in the north, not so much. You didn't have that. In the south, they could do that. Somehow, Southern culture allowed for that. Allowed Phyllis and her family and the other healers of Southern folk medicine.
Sure.
To exist.
Yeah, I can't.
The North drove that out.
Well, I can't say that I knew anybody in my hometown that did it, but that's not to say that they weren't there.
No, and I know that some of those practices were there. I know that some, like my babsha, was kind of shamed a little bit by some of the younger generations for her superstitious ways, which now I'm like looking at the little wisps that I heard of that. I'm like, oh, those were Eastern European practices that were probably very common and normal where she grew up, because she grew up in Poland.
Right.
So, and a lot of the older generation had some of those practices, and there was a big thing about how and there was a lot of shaming that happened during the time when my older relatives moved to this country. So there was a lot of loss of those cultural practices and the healing practices that went with them. And there were some things like, you put a lot of garlic in your pickles. You make pickles on a counter. That's what you do. Mm-hmm. You add garlic, you add dill, you put caraway in your sauerkraut, and you make that on the counter also.
Right.
These are just normal ways of living. They weren't considered an herbal practice. No, even though they are. People who are of Ayurvedic descent probably don't think twice about just, taking Triphala every day. It's just normal. It's sort of what you do. Chai is just normal. It's a normal drink. It's not a medicinal thing. It's got its
Yeah.
But it was just part of their culture. But because we here in America honor and respect Ayurveda, we know that chai has all these healing properties. It's good for your digestion and all that stuff. It's a medical thing too. It's an herbalist thing. Fermented sauerkraut with caraway in it has those things, but that was never something, that hasn't been something that's been like, oh, wow, this is, a big thing in herbalism, because it's from Eastern Europe.
Right.
It's just from a less popular area of traditional practice.
Right.
So that's an area that in myself has ached, because I've felt like I've learned so much, and I am so thankful for the many people who have taught me things about Ayurveda, traditional Western herbalism, Chinese medicine and herbal practice, Unani Tib. I always say that wrong. All of those different Native American practices. I mean, there's so many practices that I'm thankful to have learned, and I'm grateful that I have that knowledge. But there's always been that ache where I don't have the knowledge of my own people. I have the knowledge of America, which means I have a lot of knowledge that comes from many cultures, but I don't have the knowledge of my actual people because that's lost to me. And I suppose, I mean, I could go and learn Polish and move to Poland or start studying Polish herbals, because I'm sure that the Polish people have those practices and know some of that, maybe a lot more than I realize. It's just not popular here in America.
Right.
And it's not easy for me to get. It is easy for me to find a good book on traditional Western herbalism and what the Celts did. That's really easy to find. So Ashkenazi herbalism was a book that, even though my family isn't necessarily Ashkenazi, we don't come from the Jewish part of that tradition, but we do come from the region. And there were many things in there that, just it resonated.
As you were reading it, you were like, oh, wow. Yeah. Is there anything in particular that resonated, that you can, like an idea that can come out that you thought of?
It was more a feeling of just reading about, like, the babas that she talked about, and the midwives that had the children, helped people birth their children. And then those children were all like their grandchildren, these giant, essentially it's a giant family. It's a family approach to community. That's something that I cannot say that I've personally experienced, nor have I heard relatives talking about that. But yet it felt like home when I was reading it. Like, wow, I know this somehow. It's like my bones know it. Right. Even though I don't. But I'm remembering some of the wisdom that's in my bones in reading it. So it's... Yeah, no, I understand. It's strange and challenging to even talk about what exactly the experience was for me. And I'm not sure that, everyone's going to have that experience when they read this book. No. It's like finding yourself, like, we watched a show recently, and everything in the show resonated with me. I mean, the architecture, the art, the culture, everything. I was like, oh yeah, this is, I don't know why, but this is, my jam. And I really never really worked into it before. It was the show that was based in Norway. Yeah, it was Ragnarok on Netflix, and so there was that show. But then even before that was the History Channel show, the Vikings. I'm not a warrior. I'm not a Viking warrior, but it just, the art, the knots, the resonation, just that idea. It was like not unforeign to me. And I could understand it very, very quickly. Yeah. And I would venture to guess that maybe in your reading, it was the same thing for you. It was the same thing, where it touched an area of me that I know, sort of. Right. It was an aching part, and it was like balm for an aching part of me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. And there's a comfort there. And you say, hey, I'm not alone. Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that I appreciate, I have very much appreciated, there have been times where I'm reading, let's say it's a book on Chinese herbal medicine, and I'm reading, especially when I was first reading at the very beginning and learning about, like, the 5-element theory and the various different theories and understanding those underpinnings. A lot of times the language that I was reading then, I would understand it as if I already knew it. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't necessarily because that's my background or anything like that. It's just that they were touching, the way they used language to touch on concepts. It was like, oh, that concept, finally, that concept I've known, but I didn't know how to language it. Now there's a language, and I now understand. I can talk about it. I can verbalize more. So it was a comfort. It was a more like connecting with herbalism and the concepts of herbalism through a much more airy kind of place. Reading Ashkenazi herbalism they were just talking about the history. They were not giving practices of how to use herbs or anything like that, or even talking about the theories that the people then used. They were just saying, this is what these people did, and this is how the different people that practiced herbalism in these communities functioned.
Yeah.
But that was more like coming at it from the earth element, from this deep bone place that it's like it's a rock. It's always been there. I just didn't know it was there because I hadn't been looking in that direction.
Right.
And it was a direction that I needed to look in. You know? So I think it's understanding the history of how things were done in various areas of the world is really important to practicing good herbalism today. Well,
right. We're not unique. I mean, we're not, we can launch off the shoulders of the past versus saying it's all new, because it's not.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's not.
They may have different words for it. Different areas have different herbs that they're using, but at the end of the day, there's a discipline and a knowledge base that they brought into it that every herbalist, from Rosemary Gladstar to you to anybody now, is really launching off from these past people that kept bringing it down, and that is the hard part that we talk about. That many of the as you were speaking about the past and connection, I kept thinking, the moment in the 20th century that really defined that change from culturally passing things down, especially in the U.S. Even in Eastern Europe, was World War II.
Yeah.
And the 50s, and that whole, everyone's back and we're going to embrace technology. We're going to embrace, all of the things that they did in the war, like Chef Boyardee was food from the war. Well, that's the 50s food now.
Yeah.
Canning and freezing items and preserving in that way that you just go to the grocery store now.
Yeah.
So all of these modern women,
huge shift.
There was a huge shift of, we don't want to do what our parents did in the 30s.
Yeah, it was a giant rejection of heritage, culture, and previous generations.
Right, we're the new movement, and that's what we're going to do, and that's what they did. And I remember my mom eschewing all of that. I mean, my mom she's 65. She's not like a boomer. She's just beyond boomer, but she eschewed everything that she was taught when she was a young woman, because she didn't want that. She associated that with poverty, with low class, pain, with suffering, all that stuff. She's like, I'm not canning, I'm not freezing, I'm not doing jams, I'm not doing any of that. Even though she had the knowledge and she did it and she knew all about it. Yeah. She just chose, you know what? I'm going to go buy it because I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And I think in that case, she wasn't alone. There's so many people that decided to do that. Yeah. And we lost many things. I think, your mom and dad, I believe, were born in the 40s. So they weren't, they were just before the big baby boom.
Yeah.
Right. So your mom still, and your dad, they had their garden. They did the preserving, they did those things. Your mom kept those traditions up that she learned.
Yeah.
She didn't eschew them, but her younger siblings all seem to eschew them. They don't do that. Except for Helen. I mean, she was the pie maker, but, But, from what you've said and what we've talked about, it seems like they've all just gotten away from that. Obviously your mom at this point can't do those things that she wasn't. She's preserving for her and your dad, which there's only two of them. But just that idea that she kept it running and kept it going all the way through your childhood, even as we're adults, and for many times when we would go and see them, they would have preserves and they'd take this, take that, have this, and they never forgot it. My mom, on the other hand, back away.
Yeah. Run for the hills. Yeah. In fact, I remember your mom making a comment to me about how she had no idea why I was canning something. It was, very early in my canning career. And she kind of, I don't want to say she stuck her nose up because she wasn't being a jerk, but she was just like, why would you want to waste your time doing that?
Right.
And I couldn't verbalize it at the time exactly, why, like hindsight, I can look back and say, I wanted to do that because it really gave me a much deeper connection, not only with my own past and heritage and human past and heritage, but also with the land and the plants, the origins of the plants, the most basic nurturing, creative energy that is expressed through all of the plants and through the natural world. And that for me, a connection to that is really, really important. I need that to feel healthy and to be healthy. And I know that from that good health flows. So in making that connection and doing those simple arts of picking tomatoes, bringing them in and drying them, soaking them in olive oil and drying them for sun-dried tomatoes, or canning them to use later in the year, I was also moving that energy through my family. So that deep healing energy that comes from the most deepest, darkest parts of Mother Earth, the most nurturing parts of Mother Earth, were moving through me into my family because of this simple act of me doing the canning myself. Mm-hmm. Even though, at times, many times, I wasn't the one growing the tomatoes. I went to the farmer's market and bought boxes of tomatoes to grow because I didn't have the talent, to be honest, to grow tomatoes that well.
Right.
But, that it just felt deeply healing. Whereas taking even the most, the nicest organic tomatoes off the shelf at the market and handing over my money for them didn't feel nearly as healing to me. It didn't feel as closely connected to the earth. So, now I can say that's why I was doing that. But back then, I was like, well, it's practical. I didn't have good language for why I was doing what I was doing. And that's, even in reading Ashkenazi herbalism, it's another case where it's like, now I have some language for some of the things that I've known, but I just try to move as much in those energies as I can, but I can't express in words why this might be important or that might be important. I've been doing fermented foods on the counter for quite a while now. It feels very important to me to do that. Part of it, after reading this book, is clearly, connection to Eastern European traditions. And, after reading the obesity code.
Yeah, a book that was recommended by Don.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But, after reading that, I'm like, oh, part of why I'm doing this is also that inherent knowledge that probiotics that come from fermenting foods on your counter are very important. And I know that would have been a very important thing to my family heritage. I remember my grandmother doing it. I remember many of my great aunts and uncles doing that. My aunt with her dill pickles, those were fabulous. All of that, my mom did some of that.
Right. The vinegar is really, really important. And it's a part of our diet that we really don't do here anymore. Right. Vinegar, sours, and bitters have been removed from the American diet en masse.
Right.
Not everywhere, but let's just say the general thing.
We don't even put vinegar on our French fries, which we should. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, and the Brits do that, and other places do that. And now after reading that book, I'm like, oh, that changes this, right. And that handles the glucose and the insulin. Oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, same and if you're going to use ketchup, it should be more vinegary sour ketchup. It shouldn't be the super sweet candy ketchup that we get.
It's crap.
Homemade ketchup is much better because you don't have to put nearly that much sugar in it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And all the spices that you do, and it just makes it better. And there are a few good ketchup companies out there that make a good ketchup.
At least in our area, we
have Portland ketchup here, which they do a really good job of their ketchup. It's not sweet. It's not. Yeah,
it's more of the balanced tomato flavor.
The fact is that tomatoes unto themselves have sweetness. You don't need to sit there and add sugar to it.
Right.
I hate that. Everybody's like, let's add sugar. Let's add sugar.
Right. But anyway,
it's a sidetrack.
It is a big side.
How do you know you're hitting the big time? When you see folks wearing your logo out and about. Ace High Graphics can help you get your logo out there with custom design apparel, like hats and hoodies and tees with custom bags and more. Ace High Graphics can do small runs as little as 10 items or hundreds to meet your needs. We'll help you be seen no matter how large or small you are. Visit acehighgraphics.com today.
But talking about the vinegar and all of that, it's like now I have language, but I've been doing it for a while because I knew it was the right thing to do. And even though certain individuals in the household may have balked a little bit at the idea at first, I know those same individuals are benefiting from the action I decided to take anyway. So it's a good thing that I'm kind of like, mule-headed.
Yeah, no, here's the thing. It's like anytime that you've done these things in the past, we all look at you like, what is she doing? And you never do anything small. So you don't just say, I'm going to try this out. You're like,
it's not 8 quarts of something.
It's gonzo.
50 quarts.
It's gonzo on it. And then if it doesn't turn out, we're stuck with it. But oftentimes, it does, but it takes a little bit getting used to. I mean, when you made your first, when you really went back to it last year, I think last year was the first year that you did it. If I could correct me if I'm wrong. But when you did your first pickles last year, you and I had this thing. I was like, I don't know that I want to eat those. And because I was looking at the brine, I was looking at everything. I was like, I'm just not comfortable. And you're like, no, these are fine. These are the way they should be. Yeah. And I was like, no. They got to be like this. And you said, well, that's a vinegarization. That's a different process.
Yeah.
That's what we're all used to. Like go to a restaurant, you get a pickle spear. It's a vinegar style pickle. Which
isn't necessarily bad.
Nothing wrong with that.
But there's an extra element that comes from countertop.
Well, for one, the probiotics are gone. All of the natural ferment is gone.
On the vinegar style,
But on the other side, it isn't. And so last year I was like, it took me a few times to understand, and then you would share them and I would keep eating them. And I'm like, suddenly I got to the point where I'm like, I really like these. And then like this year you said, okay, I'm going to do it again. But you say, we're going to go to the farm stand and we're going to buy pickling cucumbers.
Yeah, my cucumbers did not grow this year for who knows what reason. Yeah. So I was just like, I'm going to the farm stand.
So we got them and you did it. And it was like, 3 or 4 days. And it's like, these are hella good.
Yeah.
I mean, I was like, every time. I'll have a couple of those with dinner.
Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah.
Which again, helps you with all the stuff that you're dealing with, the sugars and stuff they're talking about, the vinegars.
Yeah.
Get your
good digestive
going. And that's the thing. So kudos to you for keeping on that because they're really good.
Thanks. You can thank my inner mule. I'm just going to do it. So stubborn. I'm going to do it and eventually you're going to like it. I still haven't fully convinced you that elderberry syrup is good for you.
I like elderberry syrup.
Well, then how come I still have a whole entire thing of it?
It's not an entire thing. It's half. But I mean, time and place. I mean,
I know.
Sometimes it's hard. I mean, I like it in the winter more than I like it in the summer. I like when the mornings start to get cool and I want that treat without having to have the straight up sugar.
Yeah.
I will have that in my coffee. But, even then it's like, there's not many things that I eat that are really bitter.
Right.
And coffee's one of them. And I'm okay with its bitterness.
Yeah.
And so by putting a sweetness in it, I cut that. And I was like, well, I need the bitter. I need the antioxidant. I need this stuff. I don't necessarily need the sugar that goes with this.
Yeah. You've just given me a new challenge.
Oh, great.
Find more bitters to add to your diet.
Well, no, I mean, I think, we've talked about this and I know we're segueing into different topics, but, lettuces and salads used to be this idea. That's where you were going to get a lot of your bitters. That was going to be your digestive meal or food to get your body right to take on a steak and potatoes meal or whatever it was going to be.
Right.
High fat or whatever. And now when you look at you're going to have a salad before your dinner and it's like, oh yeah. So you have a salad. It's typically now I'm going to be very base. It's a basic, iceberg thing with
very sweet lettuces.
Very sweet lettuces,
bitter
almost no bitter in them.
Yeah.
And then you have sweet vegetables.
Yeah.
Typically. And then you'll put on croutons and then you'll add, maybe a dressing on it. And then dressing is going to be sweet too.
A lot of times it's dressings. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't. So if you really want to say that you want a healthy salad, your lettuce should be choice lettuce that's really bitter. Choose arugulas, choose these other things, get some other herbs in there that'll get the dandelion greens, for instance, a few other things, get those bitters going, and then choose a vinaigrette. Don't go with everything sweet. I mean, we're so inundated by sugar. There's so much sugar in our life. There's a place you can cut. That's easy.
Yeah, it is pretty easy.
Yeah.
So, anyway. I mean, it isn't easy at first to get used to lower amounts of sugar.
Oh, yeah. No, if you stop cold turkey, you can be like, oh my God, this is horrible.
A lot of people, especially like when we were kids, we didn't want that bitter. It was overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
Small children don't necessarily need the same level of bitter that adults need. Giving your kid a mostly iceberg or romano or romaine style lettuces for your salad, and then just a little bit of radicchio or a few leaves of arugula, and your kids one, just to get a little, so they're comfortable with bitter, but they're not overwhelmed by it, would make sense. Then take just a little bit of romaine and a little bit of iceberg and a lot of radicchio or kale or other bitter stuff for the adults' meals. Then the kids don't need to have super sweet dressing to cover up the excessive bitter, which isn't even right for them anyway. And you as an adult can slowly reduce the amount of sweetness you put into your dressing until you get to just something that's a little bit more balanced.
Right. And here's a little tip, kids, on your kales and your chards, any of those bitter greens. Roll them up and cut them really, really thin strips, 1/8-inch strips. If you're really having an issue with bitter, because then you mix that in with your other greens. Yeah. And it lessens the thing. I would not recommend, chopping up kale in the same way that you would chop up a romaine or a redhead, or, lettuce. Make that a lot finer. Yeah. It's easier to chew. It adds a little bit of bitter to the sweetness of the salad, so that you got it's a little nicer than just big chunks of kale.
Yes, and that's an excellent way to add sour into your diet too. So when I first started making kimchi and sauerkraut, I was the only one eating them. So the end of the kimchi or the sauerkraut, especially the sauerkraut, when you get to the last 3 or 4 servings of it, it can be pretty hecka sour. Really, really sour. And
it's funny watching Candace pucker.
I do not really like sour. I have to admit, I'm not a big sour fan.
Yeah, she eats until it gets to a point, and then she's like, no.
So done. So the way that I dealt with that was that I started mixing my, serving of sauerkraut into my salad.
Right.
And because you get it mixed up with everything else and then covered with a little bit of vinaigrette dressing, it helps take the edge off of that excessively sour.
Yeah, it does.
And ultimately, it's still healthy. So, it's another way that if you're not used to or comfortable with sour, you can add it into your salad and it'll cover up the sour a bit.
It will. And I'm just thinking about how far did we get from where we started?
Right.
Well, I mean, the fact is that we're foodies. I mean, if you look at us, you look at our kitchen, you look at what we do, we do eat a lot, and we eat a lot of different things, and we try different things, and we cook different things. So when we get onto food, we just get a little bit passionate about it.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about after talking with Deatra and Adam was how the cross currents of Eastern European medicine then in the time frame they were talking about, how the people as a whole, they had different religious or cultural practices in the rest of their lives, but when it came to health, they came together. And people from various parts of the communities all kind of saw the same groups of healers. So you didn't say, oh, can I go see the Jewish doctor? You just said, I'm going to go see the doctor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what ended up happening for the medical practices then and the herbal practices then was they were influenced by a wide variety of different cultures and traditions and different systems. So, someone who was a practitioner who was an Ashkenazi practitioner, for instance, would have been aware of some of the elements of Ayurveda, would have been aware of some of the elements of Unami Tib or, TCM or whatever, as well as some of the elements of Western European practice. All of those things kind of came together. So it was like a giant melting pot of medical knowledge. And they all took the parts that made sense and used those parts to help their own communities or help their people.
Right.
And one of the things about that resonated, I guess you could say, for me, was that here in America, we very much have that in the herbalism community, that we have influences coming from many, many directions. We have access to understanding many systems. Just because I'm a white girl a white American girl with Polish and Eastern European ancestors doesn't mean I don't get to also understand traditional Chinese medicine. I have access to that, to teachers and to understanding and learning that system. And I'm not prohibited from using those concepts in my own practice.
Right.
And it's like we have a huge variety of practices, and they aren't all just, the big Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine and traditional Western. We also have, pieces of wisdom from Native Americans. Mm-hmm. We have access to some of the Latin American and, South and Central American traditions, and those influences flowing through our many herbalists. There's just so many that we have.
Right.
So that I thought was one of the places where I was like, I can really understand what that must have been like to live in Eastern European practicing medicine at that time, in a way.
Yeah.
Because we have that here now. And especially as herbalists. Oh, and we also have access to modern medicine, and we're allowed to also know about that and learn about that too. So that I thought was really a powerful aspect of modern herbal practice. Mm-hmm. And I expect that it's not just here in America that that's the case for modern herbalism. I think that extends well beyond our borders.
Yeah.
You have nothing to say about that.
Well, it's just a lot to unpack there. I mean, there's a lot to think about. I mean, a lot of times you'll go on and you have these long drawn out pieces, and I'm still on point 4 of point 10 that you made, and I'm trying to process it. And I'm over here, and I might have missed this back part. I'm like, okay, she's going to leave it. She's going to throw it at me, and I'm going to be whiffed with my tennis racket because I'm not going to have anything. So I'm trying to think about what how I can come back and participate with that. I'm like, So, but I think you made some very valid points there. So.
I think one of the things that, at least here in American practice, that we don't necessarily have as much of is that feeling of real community. Going back to the Babas and their, their children and grandchildren and the connections that they made, and the fact that, she delivered this baby who's of a different religion, but it doesn't matter. It's not the religious practice that was the important part of that. It was the birthing practice.
Right.
And the connection that was made there. So there was more capacity for community moving cross-culturally, I think.
Yeah.
Than what it seems like, at least assuming I understood that practice. But I mean, overall, it seemed like they had a sense of community, that at least with regard to healthcare, you erase the boundaries and just focus on the health. Right. Don't worry about how the people's philosophies and, belief systems might be. That's kind of irrelevant. The more important part is we're focusing on health, mm-hmm. and how do we help each other. And I think in America, we don't have as much of that erasing of boundaries. I mean, we have so many strong boundaries around, like socioeconomic boundaries, and we don't seem to want to erase them. We want to hold on to those, right. Which then, divides our communities.
Right. Yeah, and I don't see what or how that will how it will change.
I don't know. I think that we need to. I mean, that's just the whole question of vaccinate or not vaccinate is a really potent illustration of exactly that, there's this huge division.
Yeah.
And instead of focusing on the important part, which is health for everybody, it's a focus on religious and political belief systems. And then it's causing harm to the community. It's dividing the community's health.
That's true.
That's,
yeah.
I think that's a serious disease that America has that I don't know that the Ashkenazi peoples had until the Enlightenment happened and started that whole science-only movement started to happen, and that was part of the destructive nature. Right. So we can look at that and say, you start dividing, this is what will happen. That's what happened to them and many other civilizations that have risen and fallen. Ancient civilizations, why would it not happen to us too?
Right.
Of course it will happen to us, Yeah.
Whew, a lot to think about there.
Yeah. Deep thoughts with Candace.
Yeah, right. Okay.
All righty. Well, that's a lot to think about, I suppose.
So with that, I guess, put
an herb on it.
The statements made about herbs and products on this podcast have not been evaluated by the United States Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. All information provided on this podcast or any affiliated websites is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for advice from your physician or other healthcare professional. You should not use the information on this podcast and its affiliated websites for a diagnosis or treatment of any health problem. Always consult with a healthcare professional before starting any new vitamins, supplements, diet, or exercise program before taking any medication, or if you have or suspect you might have a health problem. Any testimonials, questions, or case studies are based on individual results and do not constitute a guarantee that you will achieve the same results.